These are the two images that I have posted separately in this unit folder. And I won't go over them too much because I had some notes there for you to read. But the point of looking at these is to think about how television over the years has been imagined to be providing particular kinds of content for particular kinds of audiences. And that means that there's always a lag between what's going on in the culture and kinds of shifts that might happen socially with how the audience addresses, how the industry addresses that audience. This gets us to thinking more about the relationship between the television industry and the kinds of representations we see on TV. And the point is that when we're looking out over the history of television, we see a very slow transition from providing just the same old comforting stereotypes that have been around and acceptable and normal for what was then the mainstream white audience versus an expanding field of representation to take into consideration other kinds of audiences and other kinds of characterizations on TV. And all this comes down to a matter of not just culture changing outside of TV, but the industry's own ideas about who matters within the culture, who matters in the audience in terms of what kinds of content is produced and distributed to them. So overall, a thing to keep in mind is that the logics of the television industry can be resistive to change. That's because the strategies that are taken in order to be profitable and minimize risk often result in much more of the same. In our media industries class, this is one of the things that we talk about. It's so hard to be successful in producing media culture. Nobody knows what's going to be profitable. Nobody really knows what's going to work and not work. And so when something proves successful, you tend to see more of that, right? And additionally, it's harder for people who don't have experience to get involved and have authority to make decisions. So on the one hand, we know that the logics of the TV industry can just inherently be conservative in the sense of being resistant to doing new things. But on the other hand, there is also, throughout television history, and especially today, a need to appeal to different audiences and to differentiate the product, the television programming that you're producing, to appeal to audiences that might instead go for something else, right? So in other words, that need to appeal to different audiences, to distinct audiences, can actually compel change. So the point being, again, overall, right now, in our class and outside of our class, we have available to us a much broader range of programs in terms of representation of different kinds of people, different kinds of ways of life, different kinds of race, gender, class, sexuality. And that's not just because there's been a progression of social change since the 20th century when television first debuted, but because of industrial change, the ways in which the industry does business. So my next couple of slideshows, I'm going to trace out historically some different things that have happened to result in those changes in what I like to refer to as the landscape of television, the range of representations, the range of programs that exist across television. So, the point with thinking about representation is not just to fall into these simplistic kinds of criticism that are about, well, is a character positive or are they negative? Is this a positive representation or a negative representation? It's to get much further beyond that, because human beings don't fall into just positive or negative characters. We're complicated people, and so when we want to look at television as critics, we need to get beyond just saying thumbs up or thumbs down with programs and positive or negative when it comes to representations of different kinds of races, classes, genders, sexualities. Okay, so if we're not asking if something is positive or negative, what are we asking? We're asking, how do representations work? We are doing textual analysis to look at programs and to think about the stories that they tell in terms of race, gender, as well as related phenomenon, racism, sexism, etc. What are the stories and how are they told on television? And then that allows us to make more meaningful statements about how differences in race, in gender, and sexuality are made meaningful through television. We're asking ourselves, what is it that's being articulated in a particular television program? And using the skills that we developed, not just what happens in a narrative, but how we see it, how we experience it. That is structured polysemy. We're bringing our understanding of how television becomes meaningful at various different stages and in different ways to think about what kind of ideas about race, gender, sexuality, identity are articulated in television. All right, another thing to keep in mind is that despite the great changes that have happened over the history of television, we still live in an era where there is a very small minority of people who are not white, male, running TV shows as showrunners and on writing staffs. And still to this day, there is a lot of headway that needs to be made in terms of increasing behind the camera diversity, because the ultimate result of that is that you get richer TV that doesn't deny differences in race, gender, sexuality, but leads to content that speaks to people's lives in better ways. All right. And unfortunately, although having more diverse perspectives behind the scenes can lead to richer television that speaks to a great wider variety of human experience, the industry's reliance on people who have already proved successful, that kind of experience can also push against that.